Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome to my practical guide for web development in 2019. So this is the third year that I've done this, and a lot of you really seem to enjoy it. I will warn you, it's going to be a pretty long video because there's a lot to go through. We're going to cover practically everything that there is to learn in terms of web technologies. So if you want to watch it in parts, then by all means do that. So before we start, I just want to talk about what this guide is and what the point of it is. It's basically a step-by-step guide to all the major technologies that are involved in becoming a front-end, a back-end, and a full-stack web developer in 2019. So we'll talk about what's needed for all these roles, as well as your options when it comes to things like languages, frameworks, development tools, and so on. And it's important to know that you don't have to learn everything here to be a web developer. I don't even think it's possible to learn everything we're going to talk about. I'm simply laying out all the options so that you can kind of figure out your path. And I'll give some of my advice along the way based on my own experience and research. So we're going to go through and talk about the major aspects like front-end frameworks, server-side languages, etc. And then we're going to look at what's trending and what will be hot in 2019, so maybe you can get a jump on that stuff if you haven't already. All right, so let's get started here. The tip of the iceberg is going to be your basic software and tools that you need to actually create a web page and view a web page. So for a text editor or IDE, you have a lot of different options. The three big ones that I see are VS Code, Sublime Text, and Atom, although Atom seems to be falling off a bit, probably because of its performance issues. And notice that some of these things are underlined. These are the things that I personally use and I would probably recommend unless there's some special case. But yeah, VS Code, it just makes web development much easier. It's very fast, it's intuitive, it has great extensions, and it's definitely what I would recommend and what I see most people using. As far as a web browser, Chrome is on top in terms of popularity. It's definitely what I use and recommend. It's fast, it has great developer tools, but Firefox is a pretty decent browser as well. I wouldn't really suggest any other than these two. So for graphic design software, I put optional because not every developer needs or uses these, especially if you're working on the back end. But we have Adobe XD, which I recently switched to from Photoshop after about 10 years. It has a very simple interface, and it's geared more towards creating design mockups rather than Photoshop, which is basically, you know, photo editing software, which is overkill for what we do. You also have Sketch and Figma, which I've heard a lot about. I've seen a couple videos on, but I haven't actually used. Something that you might want to check out. I believe Sketch is for Mac only. So third-party terminal, this is definitely optional because obviously we have a terminal and command line on all operating systems, but the Windows command line isn't great for much to do with web development. Git Bash is a nice little tool you can install that has Unix commands and stuff like that. You also have the Windows subsystem for Linux, which is a bit complicated. I don't use it. Git Bash suits my needs on Windows. You have iTerm2 for Mac, which seems to be pretty popular. I've never used, though. And then Hyper is a cross-platform terminal that I think it's built on Electron, actually. And there's all types of plugins you can install. It looks really cool. And I used it for a little while, but I stopped just because I do tutorials and courses, and I want my environment to match my viewers. All right, so the first two technologies that you're going to want to learn are always going to be HTML and CSS because these are the building blocks of the web, and every single website, every web application that runs in a browser that has a layout has HTML and CSS implemented in some way. So you want to learn semantic HTML5 elements like header, footer, section, basic CSS like positioning, the box model, all that stuff. Flexbox and CSS Grid, probably the best additions to CSS that there's been. Makes laying things out very, very easy, much easier than having to float and clear your floats and all that. CSS variables were recently added. They're called custom properties, actually, but a lot of people call them variables. That's what they are. They're placeholders for, you know, colors and whatever, font sizes, whatever you want to put inside of them. Browser dev tools, you want to get familiar with your Chrome tools or Firefox tools, whatever it is you use, so you can, you know, highlight parts of the page, and you can look at the computed CSS and all that stuff. And I just want to mention that through these slides, you're going to see over here suggested YouTube videos and Udemy courses, and they're just any videos that I have that relate to the topic. And just to mention, this modern HTML and CSS course is not out yet. It will be released very soon. All right, so a responsive layout is very, very important. A few years ago, when you built a website or a web app, having a responsive layout was kind of a luxury, kind of an added bonus. But in 2019, it's a necessity. You shouldn't be building any website or UI that doesn't at least look decent on mobile devices. You should be setting the viewport. You should see the whole the whole page. You don't have to scroll over to see the rest of the menu and stuff like that. You want to utilize media queries. I'd also suggest using rem units where you can over pixels, and take a look at designing layouts mobile first with stacked columns. So design for the smaller screens and then add the media queries for larger screens. Just a suggestion, it's not something that you have to do. All right, so once you learn HTML5 and basic CSS, you're going to want to know how to actually deploy a website. And if you're just starting out, then I would suggest some kind of managed hosting. Register a domain name. I like Namecheap, but it really doesn't matter wherever you want to register your domain names. And if it's not a complicated application or it's just a static website, managed hosting with cPanel is just fine, and you'll get all the perks like email account setup, analytics, and a whole bunch of other stuff. Now, as you progress as a developer and you start to build more advanced applications, you're probably going to use something like AWS or DigitalOcean or Heroku, but for a beginner, that stuff is way too complicated. So you're going to want to start with some kind of managed solution. And then to get your files online, you could use FTP or secure FTP, which allows you to drag and drop your files. You don't have to deal with the command line and SSH and Git and all that. And it's much slower, and it's not the best way to do it, but it's much easier, and you're gonna want to learn that stuff anyways. So yeah, and then static hosting is also getting really big. So GitHub pages, Netlify is a fantastic service. It's much more than just static hosting. But yeah, these are free. They have free accounts, and they even give you a free SSL certificate. But the downside is they don't have all the bells and whistles to like managed hosting with email accounts and FTP accounts and whatever else they offer, analytics, stuff like that. But it's good for just like basic landing pages. All right, so the next thing after HTML, CSS, and basic deployment, what I would suggest learning is Sass. And this isn't something that's mandatory, but you're probably going to run into it, and it helps you write just better CSS, better structured CSS. You can use variables, although I know we have custom properties now, but Sass variables are more readable. You can nest your styles. You can use mix-ins and functions, inheritance. It really allows you to write your CSS more like an actual programming language. And there's a bunch of ways to compile Sass because the browser doesn't actually read Sass files. You need something to compile it. I personally use Node Sass, and if you watch my responsive portfolio website series, I show you how to use Node Sass. There's also GUI programs like Koala. There's a lot of different ways. There's even like VS Code plugins that can do it for you. So that's not difficult. Sass itself, you could probably learn in like 1 or 2 weeks. But you won't regret it. It's something that's easy to learn and to get under your belt. All right, so next thing is programming. You're going to want to learn how to actually use a programming language, and JavaScript is probably going to be your first language, at least the basics. Even if your goal is to be a Python developer or a PHP or Golang, whatever it may be, you're going to want to learn some JavaScript because that's the language of the browser. And you want to be able to at least learn data types, functions, conditionals, all the basics, some DOM manipulation and events. So you want to know how to make a button work. If someone clicks a button, make it do something. You want to learn JSON no matter what, because most APIs are in the JSON data format, and they're basically JavaScript objects with double quotes. Probably learn the Fetch API. Definitely if you're going into a framework, JavaScript framework or Node.js, you want to learn more than someone that wants to go into PHP or something. So definitely the Fetch API, so you can make requests to either a third-party API or your own server. And then ES6, which was an update to JavaScript that included a whole bunch of awesome stuff like arrow functions, promises, destructuring. Async await was a little later on, but still worth learning. And this is stuff you definitely want to learn if you're going to go into a framework like React or Vue or Angular, because this stuff is always used in those frameworks. All right, so once you learn HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and you have some projects under your belt, you have a portfolio, and you're pretty good at it, then I would say you're a basic front-end web developer. So you should be able to build static websites for small businesses, informational sites. You should be able to build user interfaces, take a design and create it in HTML and CSS. Add dynamic functionality with JavaScript, so things like modals and slideshows, and deploy and maintain basic websites or even basic front-end JavaScript apps. Okay, so once you learn all this, I think it's possible to get an entry-level job. Some people say no, you need to learn a framework, but I think it's possible. I think it's possible to get a job with just HTML and CSS if you're that good at it. But most likely you're going to need to know more. And of course, freelancing is a possibility. If you're going to work for yourself, you pick and choose your projects, so that's always an option as well. And I did quite a bit of freelancing, and I don't regret it. I really enjoyed it. So now you've come to sort of a crossroads of what to do next, and it really depends on what you want to do. And I'm gearing this guide towards being a full stack web developer, but you may want to get into back-end software engineering, creating microservices and so on. If that's the case, you may not care about, for instance, learning an HTML, CSS framework like Bootstrap, or even a front-end JavaScript framework like React. You may want to skip right to server-side programming with PHP, Python, C#, whatever it is you're interested in. So really take some time and think about what path you want to take. Okay, but we're going to move along to an HTML, CSS framework. Now, frameworks like Bootstrap, they're becoming a bit less relevant. I would definitely recommend learning Bootstrap or maybe Materialize or Bulma for a few reasons. One, they triple the speed for building websites and user interfaces. You already have, button classes, pagination styling, list groups, a whole bunch of JavaScript widgets to work with, drop downs. They just make building UIs very efficient. And yes, CSS Grid gives us the alignment and the grid system, but Bootstrap is much more than just a grid component. So I never really understood that argument. Another reason to learn a framework is just for prototyping. If you're building an application and you just need something quick that looks decent, and you don't feel like writing CSS, you want to work on your actual application, these are fantastic for that. So although they're not as useful as they were before Flexbox and the grid and all that stuff, there's many other aspects of these frameworks that can help with building user interfaces and websites quicker. And these are the three that I would recommend or I would choose from, but I'd probably go with Bootstrap just because it's the most popular, and you're most likely going to run into it at some point in your career. And much like Sass, something like Bootstrap is easy enough to learn that it's worth it. It's worth the couple weeks that you're going to take, or however long it takes you. You basically just need to remember class names and what they do. So as you progress your knowledge, you're going to develop certain workflows and use sets of tools pretty often. And most of these tools are used in the terminal or the command line. And I know that when people get started, a lot of them are scared of the terminal because they just don't know where to start. You don't point and click at anything. But you just want to learn the basics, just how to navigate the file structure, ls, cd, the touch command, the make dir command, things like that. And I actually have a pretty easy to follow video for all that you're going to need as far as the basics go. And you can just search for Traversy Media command line on YouTube and you'll find it. But one tool that you're absolutely going to need to know and you're going to want to use in the command line is Git. So Git is used by something like 90% of the companies that do web development. It's used for version control and storing code bases. And there's probably, I'd say, like 10 commands that you really need to know. There's more than that, but I'd say there's about 10 that are really important. You don't need to master it. You just need to know how to basically add your code to your local repository, how to commit it, how to push it to GitHub or GitLab or whatever whatever repository you're using. Also how to pull files from the repository, how to clone and stuff like that. I also have a Git crash course on YouTube. So NPM, which stands for Node Package Manager, and Yarn, these are used for installing and managing JavaScript packages. And they're very easy to use. They're used to install just about everything to do with JavaScript, from libraries to frameworks, both front end and back end. So you're definitely going to want to learn NPM or Yarn. I think NPM is a little bit easier. I prefer it, but Yarn's good as well. So you also have Webpack and Parcel, which allow you to use JavaScript modules without using a framework. Now, usually with a framework like, let's say, React, you have Webpack bundled in the CLI, so Create React App, for example, and you don't really have to deal with it, configure it. But if you want to use modules without framework, then you're going to want to use something like Webpack or Parcel. I prefer Parcel because I think it's much easier. There's almost no configuration that goes into it. It just works right off the bat. Webpack can get pretty complicated with its configuration. So you also have task runners like Gulp and Grunt, and they're not as necessary as they used to be. For the most part, you can use NPM scripts or Webpack plugins for a lot of things. A lot of frameworks like React, like I said, they have CLIs that automate a lot of the tasks on their own. So they're not as relevant, but I still do use Gulp for some things. It's really great for like minification and stuff like that. Again, if you're not using a framework. So editor extensions, every developer has a suite of extensions, whether it's Visual Studio Code or Atom, Sublime packages. Look at things like linters. So for JavaScript, ESLint, you have PyLint for Python. Code formatters like Prettier. You have dev servers with hot reloading, code hint extensions, and there's an extension for just about anything you can think of. And you're gonna just have this bundle of extensions that are yours that you always use in development. So these are just some of the tools that you'll most likely run into at some point, and they're gonna help you out quite a bit. All right, so now we're going to talk about front-end JavaScript frameworks, and there's basically three big guys. There's React, Vue, and Angular, and it's starting to become a necessity to learn a JavaScript framework if you want to work for a company. If you're doing your own thing, that's a different story, but most companies now are looking for, as far as the front end goes, they're looking for React, Vue, and Angular. And React is, I would say, definitely the most popular in the industry. Vue is really gaining traction. It's also very easy to use. Angular, I think, is fading a little bit. It's used a lot in enterprise level companies, but for companies that are just starting up now, they're really gravitating to either React or Vue. Now, it is possible to build great applications without a front-end framework using just server-rendered pages, using a template engine or something like that. But it seems to be the trend now to have your client side, a very large client side, and then have your server and just have it make requests and you send your JSON from the server. That seems to be the trend in 2018, 2019, but it is possible to use something like Handlebars or the Blade template engine, something like that, which is a lot easier, but you don't get all the bells and whistles of a framework. As far as choosing a framework, I wouldn't say just learn them all at the same time, but take a little bit of time for each one. If you don't know and you're curious of each one, take a month, build some projects with React, watch some courses, tutorials, try Vue, try Angular, and then pick what you really like. You can use popularity in the industry as one of the things that you base your decision on, but don't just go by that. Like, if you really like Angular, don't go by me saying it's fading a little bit and let that make your decision, because it's still out there. You're still going to find a job with Angular. So there's multiple factors that you want to make that decision on. All right, so once you're comfortable with a framework, you're most likely going to run into the issue of state, because frameworks like React, they have components that have their own state, meaning it could be anything. It could be data, it could be if a menu is open or closed or whatever it may be. But you're going to come to the point where you need application level state so that you can share it between components, and it can get messy without using something like a state manager. So for different frameworks, you have different solutions. React, you have Redux, which is pretty popular. You also have the Context API, which allows you to have app level state within React itself without using something separate like Redux. So definitely something to look into. Apollo is also becoming really popular, which can handle state on its own. It's usually used with GraphQL, which I'll talk about later, but it can also be used with standard REST. For Vue, you have Vuex, and for Angular, you have NGRX. Although with Angular, I find using services to communicate with different components, I find that works in many cases. So I actually have never used NGRX. So you're gonna eventually get to the point where you're gonna look for solutions for application state management. All right, so if you know HTML, CSS, Sass, and a JavaScript framework, then you can call yourself a full-fledged front-end developer, and you should be able to build pretty incredible applications. You should have a smooth and steady workflow. By now you're using Git, NPM, etc. You should be able to work with back-end APIs and data. Even if you don't know how to create them yet, you should be able to make requests to them and deal with responses and HTML status codes and stuff like that. You should fully grasp the concepts of state and encapsulation. If you're comfortable being a front-end developer, I would suggest looking for a job or freelancing and sharpening your skills even more. Start creating projects, diving deeper into front-end development. If you're looking to be a full-stack developer or a back-end engineer, then let's move on to a server-side language. So there's quite a few choices for programming languages. There's 5 that I would suggest looking at. That's Node.js, which is not a language. It's a runtime. It's basically JavaScript on the server. There's Python. There's PHP, C#, and Go. You also have Ruby, you have Java, some others. Node.js would be my suggestion. It's extremely fast, it's non-blocking, it's popular, and it's JavaScript. It's something that you most likely already know, at least some of the language. Next we have Python, which is an incredible language, and if you're into stuff like machine learning, AI, data analysis, if you're into any of that in addition to web development, then Python will probably suit you really well. It has many uses, web being one. There's 2 incredible frameworks that I'll talk about in the next slide. PHP, a lot of people give PHP shit, but I think that most of them haven't used it or haven't used it lately. PHP powers a huge part of the web. It was the first language that I learned even before JavaScript. Yes, it can be a bit messy, but if you learn good practices, it can be an incredible language. Also, WordPress is built on PHP, which is still pretty popular and powers a large amount of websites. And we'll talk about content management systems later. C# is a general purpose language and also great for server-side programming. You have the ASP.NET framework. This is the least of my experience. I've done some desktop applications with C#, but not too much web dev. It's actually a resolution of mine for 2019 is to start doing C# tutorials. So lastly, we have Go or Golang, which is another general purpose language that can be pretty powerful in web development, and I think one of the best languages to use without a framework because it has a really powerful standard library. Most other languages you're going to want to use a framework because it does a lot of the heavy lifting for you, and you might get to the point where you even create your own framework. Now, some of you may be asking why Ruby isn't on this list, Ruby on Rails. And that's because I think it's really fallen in popularity, and that doesn't mean that you shouldn't learn it. I'm not saying that it's dead and screw Ruby, don't learn it. If you really like Ruby, then learn it because there's always going to be some jobs out there. There may not be as many as some of these other languages, but that also means there's less competition. So I'm not one to say that something is completely dead and you just forget about it. If there's something you really like, then go for it. The industry and what's popular should only be a partial of your actual decision or a partial aspect of how you make your decision. So with web development, usually learning a language is not enough to build really great applications because it'll take forever. You don't want to reinvent the wheel. You're going to run into a lot of bugs and security issues. Frameworks take care of that stuff for you. So maybe at some point you can build your own framework, like I said, but at least you're gonna at least want to learn an open source framework. So for Node, we have a lot of options, but these are the three that I would suggest looking at in 2019. Of course, Express, which just is the king of backend JavaScript. I'd suggest this because it's most likely what you'll be using at a job. It's also great. It's a great light framework. It doesn't include much. Of course, you'll be installing other packages and add-ons, but it does the most important stuff really well, such as handling, routing, middleware, etc. Koa.js is also really great, very, very similar to Express. I almost like it a little more because I think it's a bit more elegant, but it's obviously not as popular as Express is. And then Adonis is a great framework, but very different than Express and Koa. It's much more high level and really reminds me of Laravel, which is a PHP framework. It has a really powerful command line interface for creating migrations and controllers and models. It's a heavy MVC type framework, and it's really underrated in my opinion. So next for Python, there's a few frameworks, but two really rise above the rest, and that's Django and Flask, which I have a really hard time deciding which one I like better. They're very, very different. Django is very high level. You basically do things the Django way. You follow the convention for just about everything. You even get a full admin panel right off the bat. Flask, however, is basically a micro framework, sort of like Express. It just gives you what you need. There's no bells and whistles, but at the same time, you get a lot of freedom and you can really do things how you want. So it really depends on if you want the freedom or the speed, because Django will give you, it will create things very quickly, but you don't have as much freedom as something like you do with Flask. I do also have a Django course on Udemy and a Flask series on YouTube if you're interested. So for PHP, there's a boatload of frameworks, but the two most popular are Laravel and Symfony. Laravel is the most popular. It's ironic because Laravel is actually built mainly of Symfony components, but the way that Laravel is put together, it's a really smooth and it's really easy and smooth experience to work with. Even people that despise PHP give Laravel credit because of its elegance. Everything can be done right from the command line tool. You don't have to go into the SQL shell or PHP MyAdmin and manually create databases like you do with other frameworks. Other PHP frameworks, I should say. You simply create migration files and run them. Like I said, it's similar to Adonis, at least in my opinion. It's an MVC framework. You can easily generate models, views, controllers. Symfony is also great, but I think it's a bit more complicated than Laravel is. So ASP.NET can be used with a few different languages, but C# is definitely recommended. Obviously, the .NET framework is extremely powerful. Like I said, I don't have a ton of experience here, but ASP.NET is a huge player in web development. All right, so most backend applications or services are going to be working with some kind of database. So you're going to want to choose a database to learn. We have relational databases like MySQL, Postgres, MS SQL. Out of these, my favorite is Postgres. It's fast. I find it easier to integrate with applications. I used MySQL for about a decade and recently switched to Postgres for applications that I build using relational databases, especially for Python and PHP apps. You also have NoSQL databases. There's a few of these, but MongoDB is definitely the king of document-driven NoSQL databases. It's very fast, it's scalable, and it's really popular with Node.js. You hear all the time about the mean stack, the MERN stack. The M in those is MongoDB, and the N is obviously Node. Something that's really catching on lately are cloud databases like Firebase, AWS, there's Azure Document DB, Fauna DB. These are databases that don't actually run on your server. This goes along with the serverless architecture, which I'll talk about soon. You connect to them externally, and I think Firebase is great for smaller apps. Some people don't like it. I think it's nice. It's a nice solution for small apps that aren't going to have hundreds of thousands of users. Then you have databases like SQLite, NEDB, which is a JavaScript database, Redis, which can be used for both caching and as a database. And these are good for prototyping and good for small apps that have a very, very small amount of data. Now, earlier we talked about the trend of having, this big client side with a framework and then having it connect to your server that serves JSON or whatever. But it is possible to use frameworks like React, Angular, and Vue on the server side. And in many cases, this can make things much easier. For example, we have Next.js, which is basically React that runs on the server. And it's easy because we can simply create a folder called pages. We can create a file in there called about.js and then simply go to /about in the browser and it will render that about page, which is actually a React component. Next.js is definitely growing, and it's something that you might want to check out. And then you have Nuxt.js, which is basically the same thing, except instead of React, it's Vue on the server. You also have Angular Universal, which I've never used. There might be something else for Angular, but I'm not aware of it. So these are definitely some technologies that are trending now and will be trending in 2019 that you should definitely check out. All right, so not every developer needs to learn a content management system. It really depends on what you want to do. But something like WordPress is fantastic for fast development of managed websites and applications, and of course blogs. And it's great for freelancers because it allows you to get work done really quickly. Clients really like it because they can update their own content. Now there are some other CMSs like Drupal, which is also fairly popular. Does JavaScript-based content management systems like Ghost, which seems really interesting to me, although I haven't used it. There's Keystone, Python-based. You have Mezzanine.net. There's Piranha, Orchard CMS, which I've actually never used. So out of all of these, the only one that I would really recommend is WordPress. Because it's been around for a while. There's a ton of websites that are powered by WordPress. It's really easy to use and pick up and create plugins and themes. So if you plan on freelancing, definitely something to think about. All right, so in addition to learning languages and frameworks, you're probably going to need to learn some DevOps and deployment techniques and technologies. Now, if you work at a company, there may be someone else or another team completely that does all this, but it's good to at least learn the basics. So deployment, you want to learn how to SSH into a server through the terminal, probably use Git to get your files on the server, which you'll probably deal with something like Nginx or Apache, which are server software that's going to be installed. There's some configuration that goes into dealing with ports and configuration permissions, stuff like that, static files. Nginx, I think, is a little easier than Apache. It's more popular now. Apache was really popular with PHP, the whole LAMP stack, but Nginx is really shining now. As far as platforms for hosting apps, there's different types. You have cloud hosting like DigitalOcean and Linode, where they give you basically a Linux container and you install whatever you want on it. You want to try to match your production environment to your dev environment. Also, AWS is pretty popular, although I think it's overkill for small to medium-sized apps. I actually prefer something like Heroku, which I find much easier to deal with, especially for Node.js apps. Azure is used a lot for Microsoft technologies, which I don't have much experience with, but I've heard good things about Azure. So setting up a dev environment, a production environment, and then having everybody you work with set up their environment to match is a huge pain in the ass, and you may want to look into something like Docker, which allows you to run your entire environment in a container, and then you can share that container, you can deploy it, you can run it on any machine, whether it's Windows, Linux, Mac, and it just makes things much easier when you're dealing with a large application that has a lot in it, as far as servers and databases and stuff like that. You also have Vagrant, but it's heavier. You need something called VirtualBox in addition to it. There's not too many situations where I personally would choose Vagrant over Docker. I do have a 2-part Docker series if you're interested, as well as a Vagrant crash course. Also testing. Testing is something you'll probably want to look at. Unit testing, integration testing. For JavaScript, you have frameworks like Jest and Mocha. You have PyTest for Python, and there's a bunch of them, and something that you probably want to look into eventually. All right, so we've gone over a ton of different technologies. If you get this far and you know a front end framework, a back end language with a framework, a database, you have some DevOps under your belt. You can set up environments and workflows. You can deploy to the cloud using SSH. Then you're now a full stack badass, and you should be able to get a job easily. All right, so now we're going to look at some, I guess, special areas of web dev technology, as well as some trends for 2019. So mobile development is possible using web dev tech. You don't need to know Java or Swift. These frameworks can actually compile web code to native code. We have React Native, which allows us to build native iOS and Android apps with the React framework. This is what I would suggest and prefer. Native script is similar, but you can use Angular, TypeScript, JavaScript. Ionic is used to build hybrid apps, which is sort of a mix of a web app and a mobile app. We also have Flutter, which is a pretty new technology by Google. It's a mobile SDK for building Android and iOS apps, and it actually uses the Dart programming language, which is really easy to learn if you know JavaScript. And then we have Xamarin, which allows you to create mobile apps with C#. So if you want to get into mobile app development and you're a web developer, these technologies make that really easy. So we can go beyond the browser and beyond mobile apps into desktop with Electron. Okay, Electron is used to build powerful desktop apps with JavaScript. It uses Chromium, which is what Google Chrome is built on, and it also uses Node.js. So you can build apps for Windows, Mac, and Linux with a single code base. It has crash reporting, debugging, and profiling. The text editors VS Code and Atom are actually built on Electron. So is the HTTP client called Postman, as well as a bunch of other really awesome apps. So it's very, very powerful. All right, GraphQL came out a few years ago, but it's been proved it's not going anywhere. It's starting to be adopted at large companies. It's basically a revolutionary way to think of and work with APIs. Okay, with standard REST APIs, we have to basically get all the data from a response. We make an HTTP request, we get a response with everything, and we have to weed through it and sort it ourselves. But with GraphQL, we can simply ask for the specific piece of data that we want, and it makes collaboration between the front end and the back end very smooth. Apollo is a client to make requests to GraphQL, and you can also use Apollo with front end frameworks like React and Vue. GraphQL is also used with Gatsby, which is a fantastic static site generator, which I definitely see booming in 2019. So next we have TypeScript, and I know that a lot of you are probably saying TypeScript has been around for a long time. Not a long time, but more so than some of these other technologies we're going to talk about. But that's what happens is things are released all the time, and everyone thinks they're going to be the next best thing, but 80% of them just dwindle away within a year or two. GraphQL, TypeScript, they're basically now granted in as legit technologies and really worth learning. TypeScript is a superset of JavaScript that includes features like static typing, as well as many ES6-like features like classes, arrow functions, etc. TypeScript has always been used in Angular, well, Angular 2+, but more people are now using it with React and Vue as well, and even on its own. So next we have serverless architecture, which is very new, but I think revolutionary. We'll see what happens in the 2020 version of this. But serverless doesn't just mean an app without a server. It means someone else manages the server, some other third party like AWS or Netlify, and you can create functions to actually run server-side tasks. So each specific function will run a task on the server that you do not manage yourself. There's actually a framework called Serverless, which is a toolkit for building serverless apps, which I really want to check out and eventually do a video on. All right, next we have AI and machine learning, which have been huge in all areas of technology, and it's starting to creep into web development. It can be used to allow web apps to adapt over time by observing and learning user habits and preferences. It does have a long way to go in general, but I think we'll be seeing more of it in web development. Python is obviously the king for this stuff, but even JavaScript, we have TensorFlow.js, we have Brain.js that deal with machine learning, so definitely something you might want to look at. So blockchain technology is being used by companies for digital transactions in order to make them more efficient, reliable, and secure. Crypto is currently down right now for the most part, but I don't think the technology itself is going anywhere. You have Solidity, which is a high-level language for implementing contracts. Mist is used for storing Ethereum, sending transactions and contracts. We have Coinbase API, which allows blockchain developers to easily build apps that integrate Bitcoin. I myself haven't had the chance to really get into this, but I read about it all the time. And if you want to get a jump on something that is fairly new and hot, then you might want to look into blockchain. So we can't forget progressive web apps like I did last year. These are regular web apps that give the user a native experience as far as layout, feel, and functionality. PWAs should be responsive to any form factor. You're going to implement service workers in the browser to handle offline availability and HTTP responses and so on. You don't want your app to go down if there's no internet connection, so you need to settle that with service workers. And PWAs are reliable, fast, and engaging, and I think that they are the future. So lastly, we have WebAssembly. It's an assembly-like binary format that web browsers can actually execute, and WebAssembly can be generated by languages like C, C++, and Rust. It's supposed to be faster than JavaScript. It's very secure as it enforces same origin and security policies. It's also open and debuggable. It's not closed off where it makes it harder to work with. So some people say it might eventually replace JavaScript, but I really don't think that's going to happen. But yeah, something that you may want to start to learn about. All right, guys, so I know this was a pretty long video. If you made it all the way through, thank you for watching. I hope it gave you some insight, and I want to wish you guys all well in your career and in your life in general. And that's it. I'll see you in the next video.